My ex-girlfriend left me for a rich man, but when he rejected her and I became a millionaire again, I came back and showed her that the real success was me. I'll never forget that day. Started like any other afternoon. I was in my small apartment working on my personal project, the one I hoped would someday change my life. The place was modest, barely decorated, but it was enough for me. I was focused on my plans, trying to carve out a way to improve my financial situation, when Sophia, my girlfriend of 3 years, walked in with a look I couldn't immediately figure out. "We need to talk," she said in a cold tone that immediately set me on edge. I stopped what I was doing and turned to her. Something wasn't right. Her body was tense, she avoided eye contact, and her voice carried a sharpness I'd never heard before. She sat on the couch and, without hesitation, dropped the bombshell. "This isn't working. I've met someone else." It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. For a moment, I couldn't process what she had just said. "What?" was all I managed to mumble. But she didn't waver. She looked me straight in the eye, with a mix of indifference and, to my disbelief, a hint of arrogance. "I can't stay with you. I need more. Someone who can give me a better life. And you can't do that." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. She wasn't just breaking up with me. She was doing it in the cruelest way possible, making it clear that I wasn't good enough, that I had failed to meet her expectations. I tried to keep my composure. "Is this about money?" I asked, trying not to sound desperate. She shrugged, as if the question didn't even matter. "Victor can give me what you can't. There's no point in pretending anymore." Sophia began packing her things, as if our relationship had been nothing more than a temporary hotel stay. I watched in silence as she gathered her belongings, my thoughts spiraling. I wanted to scream at her, beg her to stay, to reconsider, but I knew it would be useless. Her decision was final, and her disdain was unmistakable. When she walked out the door, it felt like the world had crumbled around me. The silence left in the apartment was deafening. I sat down on the couch where she had been just moments ago, trying to piece together what had gone wrong. Had I been so blind that I didn't see her unhappiness? Or had she simply changed her priorities, leaving me behind because I no longer fit into her vision of the future? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her voice telling me I wasn't enough, that someone else could give her what I couldn't. The humiliation and pain were unbearable. I felt small, insignificant, but amidst that whirlwind of emotions, something inside me began to burn. I wasn't going to let this be the final chapter of my story. I wasn't going to stay on the ground, defeated. If she thought I wasn't enough, I was about to prove her how wrong she was. That spark of resilience ignited that night. I didn't know exactly how, but I promised myself that this would be the turning point in my life. And while the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, one thing was certain. Sophia had just lost someone who was about to become the best version of himself. The weeks following the breakup were sheer hell. There was no escaping the pain, the humiliation, and, above all, the crushing sense of failure that clung to me like a dark cloud. Each morning, I woke up with a mixture of anger and sadness, unable to comprehend how someone who claimed to love me could betray me so cruelly. But amidst all that turmoil, something else began to stir within me. A quiet determination, like a flickering flame refusing to be extinguished. At first, I tried to distract myself. I buried myself in work, even though it was a dead-end job that didn't inspire me. But the emptiness lingered, a constant reminder that my life wasn't where I wanted it to be. One night, while replaying everything that had gone wrong in my head, a realization struck me. I couldn't keep wallowing in self-pity. If Sophia had left me because she believed I wasn't enough, it was time to prove her wrong. Not to her, but to myself.
I started small.
The first step was getting my life in order, something I'd neglected while I was with Sophia. I deep-cleaned my tiny apartment, organized my thoughts, and drafted a plan. A project that had lived only as a dream in my mind began to take shape. It was a tech concept that had the potential to disrupt a specific niche market. Although I had no resources, I knew that if I poured every ounce of my energy into it, I could turn it into something extraordinary. The initial challenge was juggling time and money. I worked long hours during the day to cover my basic expenses, and at night, I devoted every free moment to researching, learning, and building my idea. I enrolled in free online courses to gain the skills I lacked and started networking with people online who could guide me. Sleep became a luxury, but the faint glimmer of hope kept me going. Meanwhile, life around me continued as if nothing had happened. Sophia and her new boyfriend, Victor, seemed to be everywhere. Social media was a constant trap. Their photos together, dining at fancy restaurants and traveling to exotic places, popped up incessantly. At first, each post felt like a dagger, a painful reminder of what had been taken from me. But over time, those images became fuel. Every fake smile I saw in their pictures drove me to work harder. I didn't want their validation. I wanted something far more valuable: self-respect. Small victories started to pile up. I managed to scrape together extra cash by selling things I didn't need and invested it in tools to develop my project. Each tiny step forward felt monumental. I found a mentor, someone who believed in my idea and helped me refine the details. Slowly but surely, what had started as a distant dream began to materialize. It was around this time that I had an epiphany. I was no longer working to prove anything to Sophia or anyone else. I was doing this for myself. I had discovered a purpose, a goal that transcended what she or anyone else might think. That realization gave me a new perspective. Sophia had been an important chapter in my life, but she didn't define me or my potential. As I pressed on, new challenges arose. Competing in a world that seemed rigged for those with resources was no easy feat, but every obstacle I overcame made me stronger, more determined. There was something profoundly liberating about the struggle. For the first time in years, I felt like I was taking control of my destiny. Meanwhile, something curious began to happen. Sophia's social media posts grew less frequent. The smiles in her photos appeared more strained. The lavish trips dwindled. Though I wasn't actively seeking updates on her life, it became clear that the perfect world she had chosen wasn't as flawless as it seemed. But I didn't dwell on it. I had my own dreams to chase. That period of rebuilding was one of the hardest chapters of my life, but it was also one of the most rewarding. I learned that true success doesn't come from impressing others. It comes from finding something you're passionate about and pouring your heart and soul into it. Though I was still a long way from achieving my goals, for the first time in years, I felt like I was heading in the right direction. Months passed in the blink of an eye, though each day felt like climbing a mountain. The project, which had started as a scribbled idea in an old notebook, began to take shape. It was no longer just a dream. It was becoming tangible, something I could see and touch, even though there was still a long way to go. Every small victory felt monumental, a reminder that all the sacrifice was worth it. The first big breakthrough came unexpectedly. One afternoon, after weeks of sending out emails and messages to potential investors, one finally responded. This person had read about similar ventures and was intrigued by my proposal. While they didn't offer immediate funding, they agreed to hear my pitch. That call was a mix of nerves and excitement. I was sweating as I spoke, but my passion for the idea was unmistakable. To my surprise, it ended with an offer, a small seed investment to test the concept. That funding changed everything. It wasn't a massive amount, but it allowed me to quit my day job and fully dedicate myself to the project. I hired a couple of freelancers to refine the technical aspects, and slowly but surely, I built something ready to launch. My entire life revolved around this project. Endless hours, sleepless nights, and a lot of cheap coffee. But every step brought me closer to my goal, and the excitement of creating something worthwhile kept me going. During this time, Sophia had almost faded from my thoughts. I no longer checked her social media or searched for signs of her life. My focus was entirely on myself. However, one day, while working in a cafe, I ran into a mutual friend. The encounter was awkward at first, knowing she had been complicit in my breakup with Sophia. But perhaps out of guilt or curiosity, she started talking. Apparently, things between Sophia and Victor weren't as perfect as she had imagined. At first, it had seemed like a dream: fancy restaurants, luxury trips, and a glamorous life. But soon, Sophia realized that Victor wasn't as selfless as he appeared. According to this friend, Victor had started treating Sophia more like a trophy than a partner. He bought her things, sure, but in return, he demanded absolute compliance. Sophia's dream life turned out to be a gilded cage, and she knew it. I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction upon hearing this, though I quickly buried it. There was no point in wasting energy on someone else's failures. Still, that conversation left me thinking about the irony of it all. She had left something real, albeit flawed, for an illusion, and now that illusion was falling apart. Meanwhile, my project continued to grow. Finally, launch day arrived. It was a small event, but for me, it meant everything. I invited a few friends and the handful of contacts I had made in the industry. When I saw the first signs of interest in what I had created, I felt a surge of pride like never before. I had gone from being the broken, abandoned guy to someone with something real, something of my own. What I didn't expect was for my success to ripple beyond my immediate circle. A feature in a local blog caught the attention of a few influential people, and suddenly my little project started gaining traction. Orders began pouring in, investor meetings multiplied, and the sense of building something significant became even more real. But not everything was smooth sailing. With success came immense pressure. The competition was fierce, and not everyone was thrilled about a nobody carving out a niche in the market. There were days when I felt on the brink of collapse, but the drive to prove to myself that I could do it always won out. Moreover, I discovered something about myself. I was starting to enjoy the process, even the tough parts. As my name and project gained recognition, ghosts from the past began to reappear. Sophia, who had been absent from my life until then, suddenly started sending me messages. At first, they were casual, asking how I was or congratulating me on my success. But there was something in her tone that felt familiar, something I couldn't ignore: regret. That was when I realized something I had never considered before: the power of becoming someone self-sufficient, someone who no longer needed validation from anyone, not even the person who had broken their heart. Sophia might try to come back into my life, but I was no longer the same man she had left. I was in a completely different place, and that gave me a peace I had never felt before. This third chapter of my journey had been, without a doubt, a constant challenge. But with every obstacle I overcame, I came closer to becoming the person I had always wanted to be. When I started getting messages from Sophia, my first reaction was disbelief. Seeing her name pop up on my screen after everything that had happened, after all the silence, felt surreal. At first, I didn't know what to think. Her words were casual, almost as if we were just picking up an interrupted conversation. But there was something hidden between the lines that I couldn't ignore. A tone that reminded me of the early days of our relationship, when everything was simple and full of promises. But this time, I knew better than to fall into the trap of nostalgia. The first message read, "Hey, I saw your project featured in a magazine. Congrats. I always knew you'd do amazing things." I reread it several times, analyzing every word. Why was she reaching out now? Was it curiosity, regret, or just a polite gesture? I decided not to reply right away. I closed the message and went on with my day, though I'd be lying if I said her sudden reappearance didn't stick in the back of my mind. Over time, the messages became more frequent. A simple, "How are you?" was followed days later by, "I'd love to catch up and see how you're doing." Her tone began shifting from casual to something more personal, something that hinted at regret. It was like she was testing the waters, trying to see if there was still a place for her in my life. But I wasn't the same man she had left. What might have once been comforting now felt like a desperate attempt to rewrite her narrative. I decided not to respond to her messages, not to play indifferent, but because I needed time to process how I truly felt. I didn't harbor anger or resentment anymore, but I also had no interest in reopening a door she had slammed shut. It was strange. Her digital presence reopened an old wound, but instead of pain, I felt something entirely different: clarity. Meanwhile, my life continued to move forward at breakneck speed. The success of my project led to even bigger opportunities. Major brands started showing interest in collaborations, and suddenly, I was sitting at tables with people I didn't even know existed before. The meetings, the calls, the negotiations, everything was piling up, and I loved it. It was a sense of control, of finally steering my own ship. Every decision I made reminded me that I had reached this point through my own efforts. Still, I couldn't ignore the fact that Sophia was dealing with her own kind of chaos. I didn't need to respond to her messages to find out what was happening in her life. Through mutual friends, I learned that her relationship with Victor had ended in disaster. Apparently, Victor wasn't as wealthy as he had led her to believe, and his grandiose lifestyle was just a facade to cover up his financial mess. When the bubble burst, Sophia was left trapped with someone who was not only arrogant, but completely incapable of taking responsibility. Victor had left her with no support, and now she was back to square one. But this time, her return to the starting line was even more painful because it was accompanied by the humiliation of her monumental mistakes. From what I heard, she tried to rebuild her life, but every step she took was haunted by the echoes of the decisions that had brought her there. And when she saw my success flourishing, she couldn't resist reaching out. While I continued to ignore her messages, part of me knew this wasn't going to end so easily. Sophia wasn't the kind of person who accepted no for an answer. Sure enough, after weeks of silence on my part, a message came that changed everything. "Can we talk? I've made a lot of mistakes, and I want to apologize to you face to face. I owe you that much." That message lingered in my mind more than I wanted to admit. Not because I wanted to see her, but because it made me realize something I hadn't before. I now had something I never did back then: power. I wasn't the man she had left crying. Now, I was someone who could decide if she deserved a place in my life or not. The real question was, what was I going to do with that power? Sophia didn't back down after I ignored her initial messages. It was as if her persistence grew stronger with each day I remained silent. Then came a message that was far more direct, something I hadn't expected. "I need you. I have no one else. Please, give me a chance to explain everything." I'll admit that message hit differently. It wasn't easy to ignore the desperation behind her words. I thought back to who Sophia had been in my life. Someone who, at one point, had meant everything to me. The idea of seeing her broken and begging was something I'd never envisioned. But it wasn't enough to erase the past. I still decided not to respond, at least not yet. If she wanted to talk, it would be on my terms, not hers. Meanwhile, my life kept moving forward at a pace that barely gave me time to breathe. My business was expanding faster than I could have imagined, with new projects constantly piling up. As much as everything seemed to be going incredibly well, a part of me couldn't shake the weight of Sophia's attempts to reconnect. It was a complicated mix of pride, knowing I was in control, and curiosity about how drastically things had changed for her. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message from a mutual friend. This time, it wasn't Sophia. It said, "Hey, I thought you should know Sophia's going through a really tough time. I don't know what happened, but she seems genuinely sorry. Maybe you should hear her out, even if it's just to get closure." That message stayed with me, not because I was ready to forgive her, or even remotely interested in rekindling anything, but because a part of me wanted to see things for myself. I couldn't help but wonder, had Sophia really changed since I last saw her? Was she still the same woman who had left me for someone else? Or had the harsh reality of her choices turned her into someone entirely different? Eventually, I decided to respond. My reply was short and to the point. "Meet me tomorrow at the downtown cafe. 6 o'clock. Don't be late." I had no intention of making the conversation easy or pretending like everything was okay. If we were going to face each other, it would be on my terms. The day of the meeting arrived, and when she walked into the cafe, I barely recognized her. Sophia no longer carried herself with the confidence or arrogance she once had. Her steps were slower, her gaze more subdued. The woman who had once commanded attention in any room now looked smaller, humbled. It was a strange moment, seeing her like that, because part of me felt pity. But another part remembered how life has a way of evening the score. She sat across from me, visibly nervous and ashamed. Before she could say anything, I cut her off. "Say what you need to say. I don't have much time." My tone was cold, but I couldn't help it. There was too much history, too much emotion buried beneath the surface. Sophia began to speak, and for the first time, I heard words I never thought she'd say. "I made a mistake with you. I let go of someone truly valuable for a fantasy, and it was the worst decision of my life. I won't lie, hearing those words struck a chord. I'd spent so long feeling less than, believing I wasn't enough, and now here she was, finally acknowledging what I had always known. She went on to describe how Victor had betrayed her, how she ended up with nothing, and how she was now trying to rebuild her life from scratch. She apologized repeatedly, almost to the point of desperation. And while part of me wanted to revel in the moment, another part realized it didn't matter anymore. I had moved on. When she finished, I responded calmly, "I appreciate your honesty, but this doesn't change anything. My life is in an incredible place now, and there's no room for what we once had." Her face crumbled, but I didn't say anything more. It was my truth, and I wasn't going to soften it to make her feel better. That conversation became a defining moment, not because it felt good to see her suffer, but because it reminded me of how far I'd come since she walked out of my life. I was no longer the insecure man who needed her validation. I was someone who knew his worth and, more importantly, someone who wasn't afraid to say no. After that conversation in the cafe, I felt a swirl of emotions. Processing what had just happened wasn't easy. On one hand, there was an undeniable sense of satisfaction watching Sophia confront what she had lost and face the consequences of her choices. On the other hand, I felt a deep relief knowing that I was finally at peace with myself. My life no longer revolved around her or the shadow of what we had been. That chapter, which had remained painfully open for so long, was finally closed. The following days were a bit strange. Sophia didn't contact me again, and I had no intention of reaching out to her. However, life has a funny way of presenting coincidences when you least expect them. One evening, while attending a charity gala organized by one of my companies, I saw Sophia across the room. She wasn't alone. She was with a group of people who clearly didn't belong to her usual social circle. She seemed out of place, like someone trying desperately to fit into a world that no longer welcomed her. I, on the other hand, was accompanied by Natalia, a woman who had entered my life unexpectedly. Natalia was everything Sophia had never been. Genuine, kind, and interested in me for who I was, not for what I could offer her. Though our relationship was still new, there was something undeniably real about it. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building something authentic. Sophia saw me from across the hall, and for a moment, our eyes met. It was a brief but telling moment. In her gaze, I saw a mix of regret and longing. In mine, she probably saw something she hadn't expected. Indifference. There was no anger, no sadness, no desire to prove anything. Just the quiet acceptance that our lives had taken different paths, and that I was no longer the person she once thought she knew. The gala went on, and as Natalia and I enjoyed the evening, I couldn't help but notice Sophia trying to inch closer to me, subtly at first. Eventually, she mustered the courage to approach while Natalia had stepped away to use the restroom. She greeted me with a shy smile, attempting to strike up a conversation. "You look good, Carlos," she said, her tone tinged with nostalgia. I couldn't help but smile at her attempt. "Thanks, Sophia. You do too," I replied, knowing full well that this exchange wouldn't lead anywhere. She tried to reminisce about our time together, about how much she had changed, and how she still thought of me. But with every word she spoke, I felt more certain that my life was better off without her in it. When Natalia returned, Sophia understood that her moment had passed. She stepped back and, with a sigh, said, "I hope you're happy." It was a simple phrase but loaded with meaning. "Thank you. I am," I replied without hesitation. That night was the perfect closure. There was no need to prove to Sophia what I had achieved or what she had lost. My life spoke for itself. The mistakes of the past, the wrong decisions, and the painful moments I had endured had all brought me to where I was. Fulfilled, whole, and ready to move forward without looking back. From that night on, I never heard from Sophia again. I don't know what became of her or where her choices led her. But that wasn't my concern anymore. I was busy living my best life, surrounded by people who genuinely valued who I was and what I could offer. Sometimes, life throws us into situations that feel impossible to overcome, but those same experiences are what transform us. At the end of the day, it's not about revenge or proving anything to anyone. It's about staying true to yourself, learning, growing, and finding peace where you are. My story wasn't just one of success. It was one of redemption, of closing cycles, and of understanding that a person's true worth isn't defined by who validates them, but by who they are capable of becoming. And I had finally found my true self. Thank you for joining me on this story full of twists and emotions. If you enjoyed it and want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. What would you have done in my shoes? I'd love to hear your thoughts. See you next time.